Hey class, it's Mr. Duffy. I like to talk to you briefly tonight about due process. Due process is an idea that pretty much undergirds the entire legal system of the United States. As we talk through these issues concerning the constitutional amendments over the next couple of days, you'll see that due process is a part of every one of them. And that's because due process is one of the most important concepts coming to us out of the Constitution that protects our rights as citizens. Due process protects a person from the state or federal government from taking a person's life, liberty, or property without notice and a hearing. That's essentially what due process is. Notice and a hearing. Due process is part of the Fifth Amendment and applies to the federal government. And it has been incorporated into every state's constitution through the 14th Amendment. Now, what does all this mean? Well, basically, if the government is going to take your life, your liberty, or your property away from you, then the government needs to give you notice that it intends to do so, and the reasoning as to why it's going to take your life, liberty, or property. And then it needs to give you a chance to defend yourself, to give you a hearing to explain why either this shouldn't happen or this is wrong or whatever. So, notice. Government must tell someone, as I just said, before it takes their property or liberty. This is fundamental. This is a fundamental right. This has to happen in every criminal case. It has to happen in every civil case. It must happen. Period. What does this look like in practice? Well, quite frankly, it's called service of process. If you are going to be sued, you have to be given notice by the court or by, that you've got a complaint against you. If you are in a criminal matter, an arresting officer or someone pulling you over has to, for example, give you notice, i.e., they have to satisfy the Fourth Amendment's requirements of probable cause, and then they have to give you an opportunity to, tell you that you're going to be, let's say, indicted, or that you're going to be charged, or that you're going to get a ticket, depending upon the severity of the instance. So notice has to happen. The government must, at some level, tell you before it takes your property, liberty, or whatever. The government also has to give you a hearing. They have to give you a meaningful means of defending yourself, an opportunity to defend yourself against the charges that they're bringing against you. So if you kind of engage in a thought experiment, I imagine you can see how notice is necessary in every case involving your civil liberties, your life, your liberty, your property. If the government, this applies to the government, if it is going to interfere with these rights, notice in a hearing. Can you imagine a circumstance where the government's going to take away your life, your liberty, your property, and not giving you notice, that they're simply going to take your stuff or imprison you, or worse, execute you without telling you why? I can't think of an instance when that would happen. Likewise, if they tell you they're going to do it, what would be fair about them actually doing it without giving you a chance to defend yourself? More about that here in a second, but I want to talk a little bit more about what is life, liberty, and property. It isn't what you necessarily think it is. We talked about this earlier in the semester, but it bears repeating. Life is when the government is lawfully executing a person. Now, can the government take a citizen's life? Well, the police could conceivably take a citizen's life if, for example, they were threatening, if a citizen is threatening the life of themselves or I should say, threatening somebody else's life, with a deadly weapon, with deadly force. Would the police be justified in using deadly force against that person? Would the military, in the case of a civil insurrection, be justified in using lawful or lethal force against the citizenry if they are in armed rebellion against the government, for example? If you have been adjudicated as criminally negligent or criminally liable, excuse me, not negligent, but liable, in a case involving multiple murders or some sort of aggravating circumstance which might justify the death penalty applied to you, if the death penalty is a valid thing in the jurisdiction you're talking about, that could result in the government lawfully taking your life. So that's what life means. Liberty, the government detaining or imprisoning a person for any reason. Keep in mind that when the police wish to converse with a citizen, they have to have a reason to do it. Otherwise, they are interfering with your liberty, even if it's a de minimis or very, very small way. That's still an interference with your liberty. So a stop on the sidewalk, all the way to sending somebody to prison for life for violating some rule of society, that's an interference in your liberty rights. We're going to talk more about this when we get to the Fourth Amendment, and talk a lot more about how the Fourth Amendment works in this idea of search and seizure, searching objects or seizing a person. That's the direct interference with somebody's liberty interest. And of course, property, that's when the government wants to take your stuff or your money. Okay, so if the government, for example, fines you for a particular offense, it's taking your property away from you. If they're going to interfere, if they want to search your home, they need to have probable cause, which again is part of this whole fundamental fairness idea of due process. In fact, that's two key words for due process to remember: the idea of fundamental fairness. You must be treated, the government must treat all people in a fundamentally fair way. In fact, that's kind of the key to determining whether or not due process has been interfered with. It's to ask yourself the question, has this person, or have I, been treated in a fundamentally unfair way? If you have been, then you're almost certainly talking about a due process violation. Now, you might be saying to yourself, how would I know that? Well, frankly, it really does come down to your spidey sense to determine whether or not, do you have a sense that this is something that's unfair? If you do, it's probably a due process violation. Let's talk some examples. When you're weighing out whether or not a due process violation has happened, you kind of weigh the interests of the two sides, okay? What are the interests of the government in a particular setting? So let's say somebody wants to be, somebody is going to be suspended from school. Well, what interest is being implicated here? Do you have a life interest in going to school? Do you have a government, excuse me, do you have a liberty interest to going to school, or do you have a property interest in school? Well, most people would agree you have a property interest in your education. Okay, so being suspended from school is a pretty big deal then. The government is saying you are not going to be able to carry out this fundamental property interest that you have in your education for X number of days. So how much process is then due in that circumstance? Okay, that's the second part of this analysis. I'm going to bounce between these two screens. How much process is due in a given situation? So, and one of the key concepts to remember here is due process is not rigid. Okay, it's variable. All right, it's a very flexible idea. The due process due in one circumstance is not necessarily the due process that's required in another circumstance. So in our example that I just gave you of a school suspension, So let's say you'll be suspended from school for 3 days for fighting, getting in a fist fight. Okay, well, you obviously need to have notice of that. But what interest does the government have when we're talking about school? Well, they want to maintain a learning environment. They want to maintain the safety of other students and yourself, frankly. Okay, well, those are pretty important interests, right? I mean, maintenance of a learning environment and student safety are pretty high up there. I mean, frankly, student safety is the number one concern of schools. And if you got in a fight, then you're endangering the safety of other students. And they have a pretty strong interest in protecting other students. Okay. So they might say, look, we have this high interest. We want to suspend you. Your response is, well, I'm going to lose part of my property interest in my education. Will I be able to make up the schoolwork? Will I be able to make up tests and quizzes and miss work? Or am I going to get zeros for all those assignments? In which case, it's going to have a much greater impact. Should you be able to have a lawyer to protect your interests? Should you be able to appeal the decision of the school board to the circuit courts, for example, or of the school principal to the school board? Frankly, all of this stuff is laid out in board policies and in state law. What are the interests of the government in a death penalty case where some person has killed somebody else and they've done it in a particularly heinous or aggravating way? A death penalty case, somebody's murdered by somebody else, and it's the victim was sexually assaulted and the victim is underage. And there was cannibalism involved. I know it sounds horrific, but let's say that's all going on. These are all aggravating factors in most states that have a death penalty to cause a death penalty to be triggered. Well, the interest of the government, they want to punish the lawbreaker. They want to prevent others' serious crimes through deterrence. They want to protect their citizenry from this bad actor from hurting other people. And, government has lots of legitimate interests. Now, again, this is not a commentary on whether or not the death penalty is a good idea. This is simply an observation of an example trying to apply it to the life interest. What does the defendant have as their rights? How much process is due to that victim, to that person in a given situation? Hey, if you are going to be facing a possible execution, there is no right greater than your life. If you don't have your life, nothing else matters, right? So you're going to go through a court case, a criminal case, where you are going to be afforded an attorney. You're going to, the government must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you're guilty, and then you'll have any number of appeals, where you can argue before the appellate court and maybe up to the Supreme Court why your case or why either you should be free or you didn't receive a fair trial. And there's also a second trial involving the penalty phase. Are you liable? Are you responsible for the crime? Is the first trial. Then you'll have another part of your trial on just sentencing. Should you receive the death penalty? Even if you're guilty, you can still argue that, what I did wasn't so bad as to make me be liable for the death penalty. So think of it as a balancing act between the degree of loss of a person's rights and the importance of the government's interests. And generally speaking, you should be able to arrive at some idea of the level of due process owed in a given situation. And this chart will hopefully help you as you go through a series of requirements of due process on the x-axis, the y-axis, and the x-axis has a variety of examples of some of the intrusion into your life. I hope that helps. Please bring your questions to class tomorrow. I'll see you then.